Picture this. One of the world's most powerful technology giants receives a bombshell notification, a penalty so massive it wipes out months of profit in a single stroke. $600 million. That's the bill India handed to Samsung, and it came without warning. For half a year, Indian tax authorities combed through mountains of documents, scrutinized transactions, and built their case brick by brick. Their conclusion? Samsung had allegedly dodged its tax obligations. The South Korean tech behemoth pushed back hard, insisting every rupee was accounted for, every regulation followed to the letter. Yet despite rounds of high-stakes negotiations, India refused to budge. The fine stood firm. But here's where the story takes an intriguing turn. Just weeks ago, Samsung's chief executive officer made a highly publicized trip to Beijing. He didn't just attend conferences. He walked through the factories of China's rising tech stars, shook hands with industry leaders, and opened doors to potential partnerships. To many observers, this wasn't just a business trip. It was a statement, a signal that Samsung might be reconsidering its entire Asian strategy. Is the company preparing to walk away from India? Could we be witnessing Samsung's return to the Chinese market after years of retreat? And what does this mean for the future of global manufacturing? If you're curious about the forces reshaping international business, you're in the right place. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss our deep dives into the stories that matter. Now let's unpack what's really happening behind the headlines. To understand Samsung's current predicament, we need to rewind to why India became so attractive in the first place. India isn't just another market, it's a demographic phenomenon. With over 1.4 billion people, it recently overtook China as the world's most populous nation. That's more consumers than the United States, Europe, and Japan combined. For any company with global ambitions, ignoring India isn't an option. But population alone doesn't tell the whole story. India also offers something manufacturers crave, an enormous workforce willing to work for wages significantly lower than their Chinese counterparts. Young, ambitious, and growing, India's labor pool seemed like the perfect solution for companies looking to diversify their supply chains. Recognizing this potential, the Indian government launched an ambitious initiative 4 years ago. They called it the Production-Linked Incentive Scheme, a $23 billion package designed to transform India into a manufacturing powerhouse. The deal was simple but attractive. Come to India, build your factories here, and we'll make it worth your while. The incentives were substantial: reduced corporate tax rates, free or subsidized land, government assistance with infrastructure, roads, power, water, everything a modern factory needs. And perhaps most importantly, a promise to cut through India's notoriously complex bureaucracy with streamlined approvals. The target was clear. India wanted companies operating in China to pack up and relocate. It was economic nationalism wrapped in business-friendly language, and it worked. Samsung took the bait: hook, line, and sinker. Samsung's commitment to India wasn't tentative or half-hearted. It was massive. In 2018, the company inaugurated what it proudly called the world's largest mobile phone manufacturing facility. Located in Noida, a bustling industrial city near New Delhi, the plant sprawled across 213 acres, roughly 160 American football fields. The investment? $750 million. This wasn't a brand new venture, though. Samsung had been in India since the early 1990s, when the original Noida factory first opened its doors. Initially, the facility produced televisions, rolling out its first units in 1997. As India's economy liberalized and mobile phones became ubiquitous, Samsung adapted, adding smartphone production lines in 2005. By last year, Samsung decided the factory wasn't big enough. They announced another expansion that would more than double the plant's output, from 67 million phones annually to 120 million units. That's nearly 1/3 of the phones Samsung produces globally, all coming from a single country. But Samsung's Indian footprint extended far beyond assembly lines. The company established multiple research and development centers across Indian cities, hiring local engineers and designers to create products tailored specifically for Indian consumers. From budget smartphones designed for price-sensitive buyers to premium devices for the growing middle class, Samsung wanted to prove it understood India from the inside out. The numbers seem to validate this strategy. In the final quarter of 2024, Samsung's Indian operations generated revenues exceeding $30 billion, a robust 12% increase compared to the previous year. Even more impressive, operating profits more than doubled, skyrocketing from $1.5 billion to $3.5 billion. That's a growth rate of over 130%. For Samsung's executives in Seoul, India must have looked like a gold mine. Everything was trending upward. Market share was climbing. Profits were soaring. The future seemed bright. But beneath this glossy surface, cracks were already forming. Success in India, it turned out, came with complications that Samsung hadn't fully anticipated. In 2024, something unusual happened at Samsung's flagship Noida facility. Workers walked off the assembly line. Not just a handful, over 1,000 employees out of a workforce of 1,800 went on strike. That's more than half the entire factory refusing to work. Production ground to a halt. Delivery schedules were thrown into chaos. Samsung suddenly faced the prospect of missing critical shipments during peak sales season, a nightmare scenario for any manufacturer. The workers' demands seemed straightforward at first: higher wages. Given India's rising cost of living, this might have seemed reasonable. But as negotiations progressed, the real demands emerged, and they were far more unusual. Employees wanted something extraordinary, a hereditary employment system. In other words, they wanted Samsung to guarantee that when they retired or left the company, their children would automatically inherit their positions. They also demanded that Samsung cover all educational expenses for their children, from primary school through college. These weren't typical labor demands. They reflected deeper cultural expectations and the growing assertiveness of Indian workers who felt multinational companies owed them more than just salaries. Unable to afford prolonged disruption, Samsung eventually made concessions to end the standoff. The exact terms remained confidential, but the message was clear. Operating in India meant navigating labor dynamics that were becoming increasingly complex and unpredictable. But if Samsung thought labor disputes were their biggest headache, they were in for a rude awakening. The Indian tax authorities were just getting started. In 2023, Samsung found itself under the microscope of India's tax department for what, at first glance, seemed like a technical classification issue. The company had been importing critical components for mobile communication towers, specialized transmission equipment that helps cellular networks function. These components came through Samsung's network division and were then sold to Reliance Industries, one of India's largest telecommunications conglomerates. Now here's where things got complicated. Samsung classified these components in a way that attracted either a 10% or 20% import tariff, depending on the specific category. Indian customs officials, however, believed the classification was intentionally misleading, a deliberate attempt to pay less tax than legally required. Within just a few days of flagging the issue, Indian authorities launched a formal investigation. Samsung's legal team immediately pushed back, arguing that their classification was legitimate and had been accepted by Indian authorities for years. They insisted this was standard industry practice, not tax evasion. But, the Indian Customs Department just wasn't convinced. On January 8th of this year, they issued a confidential ruling that laid bare their position. The language was honestly harsh and unambiguous. According to the order, Samsung had knowingly and willfully submitted false documents to customs officials in order to secure clearance for their shipments. The customs commissioner went even further, accusing Samsung of abandoning business ethics and industry standards in pursuit of maximum profit. The ruling stated that Samsung's actions had effectively defrauded the Indian government, siphoning money that rightfully belonged in public coffers. The penalty was severe, approximately $520 million in unpaid taxes and fines, including a 100% penalty on the evaded amount. 7 Samsung executives in India were personally fined a combined $81 million, $500 million, for what Samsung insisted was just a classification disagreement. But India, well, they weren't finished yet. Just when Samsung thought things couldn't get worse, they did. A few weeks ago, Samsung was preparing to roll out 5G infrastructure across India, thousands of base stations that would help modernize the country's wireless networks. Since India lacked the domestic capacity to produce the sophisticated equipment required, Samsung planned to import key components from South Korea and assemble them in India. At the heart of this dispute was a component called a radio head unit, RH for short. This device is essential to 5G networks, converting digital data into high-frequency radio waves that phones can receive. Samsung classified the RH unit as an electronic component, which under Indian tariff law would incur approximately a 5% import duty. Indian tax authorities, however, had a different interpretation. They argued that the RH unit was specialized telecommunications equipment, which carried a 20% tariff, 4 times higher. The difference might sound technical, but the financial implications were enormous. We're talking about potentially hundreds of millions of dollars in additional taxes on Samsung's 5G rollout. Samsung fought back aggressively. Their lawyers argued that the RH unit didn't meet the legal definition of specialized communications equipment. They demanded that Indian tax officials suspend their investigation until the classification could be properly resolved through official channels. The case eventually landed in Indian courts. After reviewing the technical specifications and legal arguments from both sides, the court issued its verdict. The RH unit was indeed specialized telecommunications equipment. Samsung's classification was rejected. The ruling meant Samsung had been underpaying taxes on these imports. The penalty was calculated accordingly, $600 million. Let that number sink in for a moment. $600 million effectively erased nearly all the profit Samsung had generated in India during the first half of the year. Months of work, millions of phones sold, countless transactions, all of it wiped out by a single fine. For Samsung's leadership, this had to feel like a turning point. India was no longer just difficult, it was becoming dangerous. In March 2025, something interesting happened in Beijing. China hosted its annual China Development Forum, a prestigious gathering that attracts hundreds of global business leaders, policymakers, and academics. Among the attendees was Samsung's Chief Executive Officer Li Jiayong. Western business media immediately took notice. Li didn't just attend panel discussions, he made visits to Chinese companies that sent a clear message about Samsung's intentions. One visit, in particular, raised eyebrows: Xiaomi's automotive manufacturing facility. For those unfamiliar with Xiaomi, here's the quick version. The company started as a smartphone maker and has grown into one of the world's top 3 mobile phone brands. In 2024, Xiaomi shipped approximately 168 million smartphones globally, and projections suggest they'll cross 200 million units in 2025. But Xiaomi isn't content with just phones. The company has aggressively expanded into electric vehicles, smart home devices, tablets, wireless earbuds, virtually every corner of consumer electronics. And all of these products need components that Samsung manufactures: OLED displays, memory chips, processors, camera sensors. Li's visit to Xiaomi's car factory was particularly symbolic. The automotive industry is experiencing explosive growth in China, especially in electric vehicles. These cars require massive quantities of semiconductors, chips for battery management, autonomous driving systems, infotainment displays, and more. Samsung produces automotive-grade chips, and Xiaomi needs them by the millions. The math is simple. Xiaomi's SU7 electric car has been a commercial success in China, and the company is ramping up production. Every car that rolls off the line represents an opportunity for Samsung to supply components. But beyond the immediate business opportunity, Samsung's engagement with Xiaomi signals something deeper, a recognition that the Chinese market offers stability, scale, and profitability that India increasingly doesn't. Samsung's renewed interest in China isn't sentimental, it's strategic. Consider the numbers. In 2024, Samsung's sales in China grew by 12%, bucking the narrative that foreign companies are struggling in the Chinese market. Even more striking, Samsung's NAND flash memory factory in Xi'an now accounts for 40% of the company's global production capacity. Exports from this single facility to China increased by nearly 54% year over year. These aren't the statistics of a company in retreat. They suggest Samsung never really left China, it just needed a reason to double down. That reason arrived in the form of India's hostile regulatory environment. In response, Samsung announced plans to invest more than $3 billion to expand its semiconductor manufacturing base in Xi'an. This is one of the largest foreign investments in China's chip sector in recent years. Why is Samsung making this bet? Because China offers advantages that India simply can't match. First, there's the supply chain. In China's Yangtze River Delta region, which includes Shanghai and surrounding provinces, manufacturers can source virtually any mobile phone component within 8 hours. Need a specialized screw? Available locally. Custom circuit boards, delivered same day. Precision molded plastic. Dozens of suppliers within a 50-kilometer radius. In India, by contrast, manufacturers often have to import basic components from China. Even something as fundamental as mold-quality steel must be airlifted from Chinese suppliers. India's domestic supply chain for electronics has a defect rate exceeding 60%, meaning 4 out of every 10 locally sourced components fail quality standards. Second, there's market size and sophistication. China's annual smartphone sales are roughly 3 times larger than India's. More importantly, over 40% of phones sold in China are premium devices, high-margin products where Samsung can actually make substantial profit. India's market, while large in volume, remains dominated by ultra-budget devices where profit margins are razor-thin. Third, there's predictability. For all the geopolitical tensions between Western governments and Beijing, China's regulatory environment for manufacturers is remarkably consistent. The rules are clear. Taxes are transparent. Companies know what to expect. India, as Samsung painfully learned, is different. Rules change. Interpretations shift. What was acceptable yesterday might be illegal today. For a company making billion-dollar investment decisions, that unpredictability is toxic. Of course, Samsung's relationship with China hasn't always been smooth. To understand the current pivot, we need to look at what happened over the past decade. Around 2010, Samsung entered China's smartphone market with aggressive ambition. The Galaxy series became wildly popular, offering a compelling alternative to Apple's iPhone at more accessible prices. By some estimates, Samsung sold approximately 30 million smartphones in China in its peak years. By 2013, Samsung commanded nearly 30% of China's smartphone market, the single largest share of any brand. The company deployed what industry analysts called a sea of phones strategy, flooding the market with devices at every conceivable price point. From ultra-budget models to flagship devices, Samsung had an option for every consumer. Then everything changed. Starting around 2016, Chinese domestic brands began their meteoric rise. Huawei, Xiaomi, Oppo, Vivo, these weren't cheap knockoffs. They were genuinely innovative companies producing high-quality devices with features Chinese consumers loved. Exceptional cameras, fast charging, sleek designs, and prices that undercut Samsung by 20 to 30%. At the same time, Samsung suffered a devastating public relations disaster, the Galaxy Note 7 exploding battery crisis. Reports of phones catching fire on airplanes and in people's pockets dominated global headlines. Samsung was forced to recall millions of devices, and the brand damage in China was catastrophic. Chinese consumers, already attracted to domestic brands, had one more reason to avoid Samsung. Why risk buying a foreign brand that might explode when Chinese alternatives were cheaper, better, and safer? By 2017, Samsung's market share in China had collapsed to just 3.3%. The company that once dominated Chinese electronics had been effectively pushed to the margins. Unable to compete in China, Samsung looked for alternatives. American policymakers, eager to reduce manufacturing dependence on China, suggested India as the perfect solution. Samsung listened. When Samsung first announced major investments in India, the reception was honestly euphoric. Indian government officials rolled out the red carpet. They promised reduced tariffs on electronic components, which really helped Samsung keep costs competitive. Land approvals were fast-tracked, cutting through bureaucratic processes that would normally take years. They even assisted with workforce recruitment, essentially acting as Samsung's human resources department. With this level of support, Samsung's Indian operations took off quickly. Within just a few years, the company captured top positions in multiple product categories. In smartphones, Samsung frequently ranked as the #1 or #2 brand, selling nearly 30 million devices annually. The home appliance business performed even better. Samsung's market share for televisions, refrigerators, and washing machines exceeded 20%, dominance in categories with high profit margins. Between phones and appliances, Samsung was reportedly generating $7 to $8 billion in annual profits from India. For a while, it seemed like the perfect partnership. India got jobs, technology transfer, and, prestige from hosting a global tech giant. Samsung got access to a massive market with government support and lower costs than China. But as Samsung's presence grew, so did Indian authorities' interest in the company's financial affairs. Samsung isn't alone in facing aggressive scrutiny from Indian tax authorities. In fact, the company's experience follows a pattern that's become, disturbingly common. In 2022, Indian authorities launched an investigation into Vivo, the Chinese smartphone maker, under anti-money laundering laws. Without warning, the government froze approximately $58 million sitting in Vivo's Indian bank accounts. Several company executives were detained for questioning. The investigation dragged on for months, paralyzing Vivo's operations. A year later, in June 2023, Xiaomi received similar treatment. Indian enforcement directors announced they were freezing over $40 million of Xiaomi's funds, citing allegations that the company had illegally transferred money to foreign entities. Xiaomi protested that all transactions were legitimate royalty payments and standard business operations, but the freeze remained in place. The scale of this crackdown is, honestly, breathtaking. Over the past 5 years, the Indian government has reportedly collected more than $20 billion in back taxes, penalties, and fines from foreign companies. That's an average of $4 billion per year. Breaking it down further, Indian authorities have frozen an average of $120 million in foreign company assets every single day. Chinese social media users even coined a darkly humorous phrase to describe doing business in India: make money in India, spend it in India, don't expect to take a single rupee home. But why is India doing this? The answer lies in the country's precarious financial position. As of 2024, India's foreign exchange reserves stood at approximately $580 billion, a substantial sum by most measures. But here's the problem. India's total foreign debt reached $620 billion, meaning the country owes more money abroad than it has in reserves. This creates a dangerous vulnerability. If creditors suddenly demanded repayment, or if India faced a currency crisis, the government wouldn't have enough dollars, euros, and yen to meet its obligations. Making matters worse, multinational corporations operating in India repatriate enormous sums of profit every year. According to economic analyses, foreign companies transfer approximately $40 billion annually out of India to their parent companies abroad. Every dollar that leaves India is one less dollar in the country's foreign exchange reserves. India also runs a massive trade deficit, importing far more than it exports. In recent years, this deficit has exceeded $240 billion annually, particularly driven by imports of oil, electronics, machinery, and raw materials. Every month, billions of dollars flow out of India to pay for these imports. The service sector, particularly IT outsourcing and business process outsourcing, brings some foreign currency back into India. However, these inflows aren't nearly enough to offset the outflows from trade deficits and profit repatriation. Faced with this foreign exchange squeeze, the Indian government has adopted what economists call invisible capital controls. Officially, India welcomes foreign investment and encourages companies to operate freely. But in practice, the government has found creative ways to prevent money from leaving the country. This is where the aggressive tax enforcement comes in. By launching investigations, imposing massive fines, and freezing assets, Indian authorities force foreign companies to keep their profits inside India. The message is subtle but clear. You're welcome to make money here, but taking it home won't be easy. Faced with this increasingly hostile environment, more companies are reconsidering their India strategies and, honestly, looking back toward China. Samsung is just the most prominent example, but the trend is broader. Supply chain managers at dozens of multinational corporations are quietly running scenarios. What would it take to shift production back to China? How much would it cost to expand existing Chinese facilities rather than build new ones in India? The calculations are becoming more favorable. Yes, labor costs are somewhat higher in China than India. But when you factor in supply chain efficiency, quality control, infrastructure reliability, and regulatory predictability, China often comes out ahead.